Nobody ever planned for a city like this to exist out here, not in this stretch of land, not at this scale, not planted deep inside one of the harshest desert corridors on the entire continent. The Mojave squeezes out roughly 4 inches of rainfall every year. Summer heat punches past 115 degrees without apology. The soil beneath the streets is ancient, cracked, and bone dry. There are no rivers cutting through the valley floor, no lakes sitting within reasonable distance, no underground water reserves capable of keeping a meaningful population alive. By every rule that nature has consistently enforced, a large city had no business taking root here. And yet more than 2.3 million people live there today. In 1940, this was a railroad stop with around 8,000 residents, small, forgettable, easy to drive past without a second thought. Then came the gambling halls, the federal highways, the mechanical air cooling that made indoor comfort possible, and the distinctly American obsession with building something new somewhere nobody else had tried. The population swelled in ways that no planner had anticipated and no water manager had prepared for. Through the 1970s, the city was expanding faster than nearly anywhere else on the map. Through the 1990s, it had become one of the most aggressively growing metro areas the country had ever seen. Today, 40 million tourists pass through the Las Vegas Valley every single year, and the growth curve shows no sign of flattening. Every one of those people requires water. The city draws roughly 300,000 acre-feet of water annually. That translates to nearly 98 billion gallons. To make that figure land properly, it is enough water to put 3 feet of liquid across every inch of Manhattan every single year. And close to 90% of every drop comes from a single source. Lake Mead, fed by the Colorado River. That is not an auxiliary option or a secondary backup. It is the entire strategy. The Southern Nevada Water Authority, the organization responsible for keeping this city functioning, manages this precarious balance every single day. Their entire operation leans on a reservoir stretching across the Nevada and Arizona border, constructed during a period when the Colorado River felt unlimited. It was not unlimited. It never had been. The Colorado River Compact was signed in 1922 and divided the river's supply across 7 states based on flow data collected during some of the most water-rich decades the region had ever recorded. Scientists understand now that those readings were dangerously misleading. The agreement handed out more water than the river actually generates across most years. That single error in judgment has been compounding quietly across an entire century. The city inherited a water future built on miscalculation, a ballooning population, a river gradually shrinking, and a single lake standing as the only barrier between 2.3 million people and a genuine catastrophe. For most of the 20th century, Lake Mead looked solid, unchangeable, an unquestioned fixture of the American West, as reliable as the stone walls surrounding it. The Colorado flowed, the reservoir stayed full, and the cities downstream poured water without pausing to consider what might happen if that relationship ever shifted. Then, in the early 2000s, the lake started dropping, slowly at first, quietly, barely perceptible. Most people never registered the change. Water managers registered it immediately. Through the 2010s, the pace picked up. Season after season, the water fell lower than any model had forecast and bounced back less than any projection had assumed. The gap between incoming water and outgoing water was not shocking in any individual year. It was steady across every year, stacking up quietly the way a balance due accumulates over time when nobody is making payments. By 2021, federal authorities could no longer stay silent. Officials declared the first ever formal shortage on the Colorado River, triggering mandatory supply cuts across multiple states at once. For the first time in the river's managed history, the system had openly acknowledged it could not keep the commitments it had made. By July 2022, Lake Mead had fallen to just above 26% of its total holding capacity, the lowest point ever measured since the reservoir first filled in the 1930s. A lake that once spread across 247 square miles and plunged 532 feet at its deepest was hollowing out from within. The numbers were severe. The visuals were something else entirely. Boat launches sat marooned hundreds of feet from the waterline, their concrete ramps sloping uselessly into dried, bleached lake bottom. A pale mineral band crept up the canyon walls like a wound, marking every foot of water the reservoir had surrendered. Buried structures began pushing back up through the exposed floor. Submerged roads, old foundations, the remnants of St. Thomas, a resort community that had been underwater since 1938, breaking back into daylight as the water pulled away. Lake Mead was not merely shrinking, it was uncovering its own buried past as it came apart. Intake number 1, installed in 1971 at an elevation of 1,050 feet, was now operating dangerously near the edge of its functional range. Intake number 2, added in 1993 as a hedge against this exact situation, was never designed for water at these depths. Both pipes were built for a world in which the Colorado delivered what the 1922 agreement had guaranteed. That world was already gone. Inside the Water Authority, the internal dread was no longer contained. The city that had no logical right to exist was staring directly into a future that none of its original builders had ever needed to imagine. The solution that emerged was bold to the point of seeming unreasonable. The execution required pushing human engineering to its edge. And the final cost, when it landed, left even the most seasoned infrastructure professionals momentarily speechless. Engineers at the Southern Nevada Water Authority had a single objective: build a third intake pipe positioned so far below Lake Mead's surface that no drought in any living record could ever pull the water away from it. Not near the bottom, beneath it, tunneled through the bedrock below the lake floor itself, reaching water sitting at an elevation of 860 feet. Lower than the dead pool threshold, lower than either existing intake could access, lower than any municipal water intake had ever been built anywhere in the United States. To reach that point, they would need to bore a tunnel 3 miles long through solid volcanic basalt, some of the most resistant rock on the continent, while working hundreds of feet below an active reservoir holding trillions of gallons directly above their heads. Construction launched in 2008. From the opening week, nothing went smoothly. A massive tunnel boring machine nicknamed Sandy by the workers who ran her was assembled underground and began cutting through the basalt layer by layer. Sandy measured 23 feet across, wide enough for 2 lanes of vehicle traffic through the completed tunnel. She was precise, powerful, and still caught completely off guard by what the geology had stored away for her. Unexpected rock formations forced crews to halt and rework entire sections. Equipment failed under pressures that the engineering calculations had not fully captured. Water pushed through cracks in the stone, threatening to drown active tunnel sections before seal work could advance fast enough. The underground heat was relentless. Workers operated in compressed, deafening environments, drilling through ancient volcanic rock with an active lake pressing down directly overhead. Project engineers described the work as threading a needle through a mountain while wearing a blindfold submerged in water, with no room for a single mistake. Sandy finished her run in 2014. The tunnel was sealed, pressure tested, and declared operational in 2015. The engineering had held, the impossible structure existed. Then came the invoice, $1.4 billion. The single most expensive municipal water infrastructure project in American history, paid entirely by the residents and businesses of Southern Nevada through water rates that climbed year after year while the drilling continued underground. Las Vegas households watched their bills rise not because they were consuming more water, but because they were funding the tunnel beneath the lake that kept the water flowing to their taps. Objections came fast. Environmental advocates argued the third intake sent entirely the wrong signal, that Las Vegas could keep expanding indefinitely because the engineering would always find a deeper solution. The Water Authority gave a simple answer: they do not build for optimistic projections. In desert conditions, the worst-case scenario tends to arrive ahead of schedule. The satellites had confirmed the emergency. The engineers had measured it precisely. The water managers had lived inside it every day. But the most disturbing evidence did not come from any instrument built in the modern era. It came from trees. Dendrochronology is the practice of decoding climate history stored inside tree rings. Every growing season adds a new layer. A wide ring means a wet year, steady water supply, favorable conditions. A thin ring means drought, scarcity, struggle for survival. Thousands of rings packed inside a single trunk become a detailed log of everything the climate did long before anyone was there to write it down. Researchers across the Colorado River Basin have studied thousands of these records, cross-referencing ancient specimens to assemble a continuous climate history reaching back more than 1,000 years. What that archive shows should unsettle every water manager across the American West. The Colorado River Basin has gone through mega droughts before, not dry stretches lasting a few seasons, droughts that ran for decades. Sustained, civilization-ending dry periods far more extreme and far longer than anything the modern measurement record contains. The 20-year stretch that pushed Lake Mead down to 26% capacity was not unusual inside that longer timeline. It was not even particularly rare. Droughts of equal or greater force appear in the tree ring record multiple times across the past millennium. Entire cultures that built their survival around this river system collapsed under conditions the modern period has not yet experienced. The ruins they left behind still surface from the retreating lake floor from time to time. That 20-year dry run may not have been the crisis. It may have been the rehearsal. Then came the winter of 2022 into 2023, and for a brief window it felt like the pressure had eased. Record snowfall buried the Rocky Mountains. Snow levels across the upper Colorado River Basin blew past seasonal averages by extraordinary margins. As temperatures climbed through spring, that accumulated snowpack released gradually, feeding streams and tributaries that eventually drained toward Lake Mead. The reservoir gained more than 20 feet in a single year. Lake Powell upstream added more than 50 feet in the same window. The Bureau of Reclamation discarded its decline models entirely and rebuilt its forecast from scratch. Scientists pushed back immediately. One exceptional snow season does not undo 20 years of structural overconsumption. The lake remained more than 160 feet below full capacity. The recovery was genuine. It was also temporary, entirely weather-dependent, and built on conditions that climate projections suggest will grow increasingly infrequent. The third intake reaches water at 860 feet elevation. That number was selected with precision. But the Colorado River operates against a harder limit. Full dead pool sits at 895 feet. Below that line, no water can move past Hoover Dam under any physical condition. The pumps still function. The tunnel remains intact. The third intake still sits at 860 feet. But if the lake drops below 895 feet, the water that intake was constructed to access simply no longer exists. The engineering achievement beneath the lake floor becomes an extraordinarily expensive monument to how precisely a problem can be solved and still fall short of what the situation actually requires. The third intake secured access to the deepest water in the reservoir. It did not secure the water itself. Below the surface, a separate threat is building silently. As Lake Mead's levels swing dramatically with each cycle of drought and partial recovery, sediments on the lake floor are stirred up and carried into suspension. Those sediments hold heavy metals and toxic residue accumulated from decades of mining and industrial use along the shoreline. When the water rises, it floods old contaminated areas that had been considered safely contained while submerged and undisturbed. When levels drop, those same zones are exposed and disturbed all over again. The third intake guarantees access to water at depth. It does not guarantee what that water contains. And then there is the problem that no single city can construct its way around. 40 million people across 7 states depend on the Colorado River. Las Vegas is not the only city watching this reservoir. Phoenix draws from the same network. Los Angeles pulls from the same allocation. Farmers across Arizona and California water fields with a supply the river can no longer consistently deliver. Federal proposals to route flow around Glen Canyon Dam entirely, restoring some function to a river system being consumed faster than nature can refill it, reflect how deeply the underlying logic has already shifted. Infrastructure built for one era is being reconsidered for a completely different one. The Water Authority plans around worst-case conditions because the worst case keeps arriving early. The third intake cost $1.4 billion, took 7 years to build, and answered one very specific question about how far a city would need to drill to stay alive. It did not answer the harder question sitting underneath that. Was the city securing its future, or was it simply purchasing additional time? The drilling is done. The engineering decision has already been made. The desert is still winning. And the desert has never once been known for patience. But Las Vegas did not only drill down, it also pulled back. The city understood early that infrastructure alone could not solve a mathematical problem this severe. A metro area consuming 98 billion gallons annually, drawing from a shrinking reservoir in a region growing measurably hotter each decade, cannot outlast the math through tunnels alone. No intake, regardless of depth, can outrun those numbers permanently. So alongside the third intake, the Water Authority constructed something that cannot be photographed or measured in feet of elevation. They built a collective habit, and the outcome is genuinely difficult to argue with. Since 2002, Las Vegas has reduced its per-person water use by more than 40%. Not in spite of population growth, but during it. The metro area absorbed hundreds of thousands of new residents over that same stretch, and still managed to consume less total water than it had 2 decades earlier. By any fair accounting, it stands as one of the most dramatic urban conservation reversals in American history. The mechanisms that produce that number are deliberate and wide-reaching. Las Vegas recycles approximately 99% of its indoor water. Treated wastewater returned to Lake Mead earns the city return flow credits that count directly against its annual Colorado River entitlement. Every gallon used inside a building and sent back into the system is effectively put to work twice. No other major American city operates at this level of indoor water recovery. It is a precise solution to an impossible equation. Outdoor water use was where the harder fight unfolded. Nevada passed laws banning decorative grass, the ornamental turf lining medians, wrapping office buildings, and covering suburban front yards without serving any purpose beyond aesthetics. The removal program is expected to save roughly 6 billion gallons of water annually. 6 billion gallons that previously evaporated under a punishing desert sun, doing nothing but looking green. Residential water use became the next pressure point. Nevada advanced legislation giving water managers authority to cap household consumption at roughly 163,000 gallons per year, the first regulation of its type anywhere in the country. Residents objected, but the core logic was impossible to dismiss honestly. When a resource is genuinely limited, unlimited individual consumption is not a right the system can keep subsidizing. Broader coordination added another necessary layer. Tucson voluntarily reduced its Lake Mead allocations, giving back water it was legally entitled to claim. Federal buyout programs encouraged other communities across the basin to follow. The Colorado River Compact renegotiation, with its 2026 deadline now pressing close, forced 7 state governments into long overdue conversations about dividing a river that no longer produces what the original document assumed it would. Las Vegas changed everything within its reach, and the lake was still not safe. The tunnel exists. The conservation numbers are real. The lake has partly recovered. None of it closes the gap entirely. The 2026 renegotiation of the Colorado River Compact is the moment that water managers, climate researchers, and 7 state governments have been quietly bracing for across many years. The 1922 agreement was assembled using data from some of the most water-rich decades the region had seen. It guaranteed a supply the river could not reliably deliver even at the time it was signed. More than a century later, with the basin running hotter and drier than at any point in the modern record, those 7 states must sit across from one another and decide how to divide a resource that continues shrinking and cannot be replaced. How that conversation ends will determine whether cities keep expanding, whether farms across the Southwest survive another generation, and whether the tunnel beneath Lake Mead ever gets pushed to its absolute edge. Las Vegas is not a cautionary tale, not exactly. It is something more layered and more instructive than that, a city that looked at an impossible situation and refused to stop finding ways through it. The third intake is real. The conservation numbers hold up. The tunnel sits right now in permanent darkness beneath the floor of a retreating lake, drawing water from depths no drought in the modern record has ever touched. That is not a small thing. That is extraordinary. A genuine feat of what a city can achieve when the alternative is watching the water disappear entirely. But Las Vegas is not the only story here. It is simply the most visible point on the most exposed fault line of a water emergency stretching across the entire American West. Phoenix is watching the same reservoir. Los Angeles draws from the same river. Farmers across Arizona and California irrigate with the same allocation the 1922 compact promised, and the Colorado can no longer reliably produce. The engineering beneath Lake Mead was designed to solve one city's problem. It was never designed to solve the basin's problem. And the basin's problem is deepening. The snowpack will not always come back this strong. The lake will not always bounce back this far. One exceptional winter does not erase what the tree rings have already recorded across 1,000 years of this river's history. The mega droughts arrived before. The civilizations built on this water disappeared. The ruins occasionally push back up from the receding lake floor as a quiet reminder of how this story has resolved itself before. The third intake bought time. Time for conservation programs to expand. Time for policy to finally align itself with physical reality. Time for the lake to draw a steadier breath. Whether that time gets spent wisely is no longer an engineering question. That tunnel is already there. The decision is already made. The desert is still advancing, and it has never once in its long history been known to wait. Lake Mead's situation is not a Las Vegas problem. It never was. It is a signal visible from space, readable in the growth rings of trees that were standing centuries before this city existed, and measurable in the slow retreat of a shoreline pulling back for more than 20 years. The same pressure is playing out from Phoenix to Los Angeles to every irrigated valley, drawing from a river that 40 million people treat as permanent, and the data increasingly suggests is not. The tree rings do not distort or embellish. They have recorded this before. Long dry periods came to this basin, and the cultures that had built their survival around this water collapsed, faded, and left behind only ruins that the lake occasionally brings back to the surface as it continues pulling away. Those ruins are not warnings left behind by people who lack the ability to adapt. They are evidence that this river under prolonged pressure has a ceiling, and that ceiling does not care about agreements signed in 1922, tunnels completed in 2015, or the 40 million people who have built their entire existence on the assumption that the water will always arrive. Las Vegas drilled the deepest water intake in American history. The tunnel exists right now in total darkness under enormous pressure beneath the floor of a disappearing lake, pulling water from depths no drought has ever reached in recorded time. The engineering is extraordinary. The conservation is genuine. The crisis is not finished. Somewhere beneath the surface of Lake Mead, the clock is still counting, and the tree ring suggests it has been running far longer than anyone was prepared to acknowledge.